Welcome to Study Loop.
So for this question, it's actually referencing an example that was given, I believe, on pages 1706, '07, and '08 in your textbook. It was an example using the English Channel and the ecosystem in it and the various trophic levels and the biomass at each level. And basically, I've done a little bit of tiny recreation of one of the graphs that was in your book about this. The primary producers, or the phytoplankton in this case, are or have a relatively small biomass compared to the zooplankton, which are the primary consumers in this ecosystem. And this is not super typical, at least in when we generally think about ecosystems, especially terrestrial ecosystems, the primary producers tend to be a lot larger in terms of biomass or energy, either of them, um, relative to the primary consumers who tend to be slightly smaller or a lot smaller, depending on the ecosystem. So this is already something slightly different than what we might originally conceive. And we also have to remember that this is the typical scenario. This isn't, out of ordinary. There's something wrong with this ecosystem. This isn't aberrant. This is the ecosystem as is. And we need to consider, well, how can this be? What would make this function? And to do that, let's take a look at our multiple choice options and see um, which ones make the most logical sense. We have option A is that the primary consumers have a high turnover rate. And a lot of these use the term we have high turnover rate and low turnover rate pop up in all of the multiple choice options. So let's go ahead and define those first. High turnover rate would be basically saying that they turn over very fast, meaning that they reproduce quickly after dying. So if a lot of organisms die, then relatively quickly you're going to see a lot of new organisms. Or that usually the implication is they reproduce quickly enough to offset any loss in the population because it's happening really fast. Low turnover rate would be the opposite, in that you have like a lot of dead or organisms that have died or been eaten, what have you, and the generation of the next, the new generation is relatively slow. So you're not going to see a huge replacement in the population as you would in the high turnover rate scenario. So those are like the things that are happening in this question. So let's take a look at our multiple choice options here. So option A is that the primary consumers have a high turnover rate. B is primary producers have a low turnover rate. C, the apex consumers have a low turnover rate. And D, the primary producers have a high turnover rate. So let's go ahead. I think it's safe to say that we can go ahead and discount options A and C. C, because the apex consumers aren't really at hand right here. We're looking at the primary consumers, or the ones who are actually eating the phytoplankton right now. And option A, because while it is dealing with the primary consumers, them having a high turnover rate wouldn't actually explain why the primary producers have a lower biomass in them. Other than, in that case, you would think, well, they're having a lot of new births, so they might be consuming a lot more. But in that case, this wouldn't be sustainable. So there's something else that must be happening here, and it is most likely happening at the phytoplankton or the primary producer level. And in that case, we're left with whether they have a low turnover rate or a high turnover rate. And again, let's take a look at our two definitions here. So if it was a low turnover rate, let's start with option B, then these phytoplankton would be eaten. A lot of them would be eaten, and then we'd have in the next generation a tiny sliver that was left because they wouldn't be, reproducing fast enough to keep up with this loss. And if that was the case, then there wouldn't be enough phytoplankton to sustain all of the primary consumers at this upper level. So in that case, the low turnover option B probably isn't sustainable. And so in this case, let's take a look now at the high turnover rate. In that example, as all of these, phytoplankton are being eaten by the zooplankton, they're also reproducing at a fast enough rate in order to replenish the population that's been lost from consumption. And in that case, that would actually explain how this setup works and thrives, because you're not actually going to be losing any population here that would cause a detriment to this population. And if this population can survive off of this level of biomass, then it wouldn't need to change anything really. So that means that the primary producer's biomass is lower than that of the primary consumers in this particular ecosystem, because the primary producers have a higher turnover rate, which is option D. And that is our